David and Kimberly's story began in 1988 when 24-year-old David met Kimberly, 23, by chance. Kimberly, who is loved and cherished by many people, has become the ideal life partner in David's eyes. The couple quickly fell in love and decided to get married in the spring of 1989. That same year, David joined the Indiana State Police, where he demonstrated outstanding ability and was quickly recruited into the emergency response unit. Kimberly and David's family life became more complete when they welcomed their first son, Bradley, in February 1993. However, things began to change in the summer of 1994, when David had an affair with Stephanie McCarty, a young woman he met at the gym. This relationship created many challenges for Kimberly, especially when she was pregnant with her second child. The arrival of his second child made the situation more tense, leading David to decide to leave the house and move in with his mistress. Despite her struggles, Kimberly found support from her family, who were always there for her during her difficult times. In February 1995, Kimberly gave birth to daughter Jill. This was a moment of joy but also of pain because David was not present at this important moment. Although Kimberly endured the pain of her husband's betrayal, her love for David and her role as the mother of 2 children kept her from giving up hope. David and Stephanie's affair ended in March 1995, and David sought to reconcile with Kimberly. Despite the pain and hurt, Kimberly decided to give David a second chance, and the two reunited. The decision came as a surprise to both families, but they supported Kimberly in welcoming David back into their lives. David and Kimberly begin a new chapter in their lives, moving to a new home in Georgetown, Indiana, where they look forward to rebuilding their family life. David spent more time with their 2 children, Bradley and Jill, and the family spent many happy days together. While Kimberly works as a senior accountant at an insurance group, David also found stability when he switched to working in basement waterproofing, which brought in double the income of his previous job. Everything changed unexpectedly on the morning of September 28, 2000. That day started as a normal day for Camm's family. Kimberly wakes up at 6 a.m. and prepares for the day with her children. After taking the 2 children to school, she arranged her work and planned to pick up Jill after school. Meanwhile, David goes to work and attends a weekly basketball game with friends. After the match ended around 9:20 p.m., David drove home. When he approached the garage door, he couldn't believe his eyes. His entire family died, a painful scene no one could imagine. David becomes the victim of the worst tragedy, where pain and loss will follow him for life. David reported the terrible tragedy to the Indiana State Police Department, where he had worked. Minutes later, officers from ISP, including Shan Clemens, his former colleague and best friend, arrived at the scene. Shan begins to investigate and calls David for an interview about what happened. In a state of panic, David explained that after returning from the basketball game, he went into the garage to park his car. As soon as he entered, he saw Kimberly lying motionless, with a severe head wound and bleeding. A feeling of despair overwhelmed him as he bent down to call her name but only received silence. Remembering the 2 children, he turned his head to look at the family's Ford Bronco. When David looked into the back seat, he saw both Bradley and Jill lying there. Jill, still wearing a seatbelt, was seriously injured and passed away. Bradley sat slumped in the back seat with a chest wound, as if he had tried to run away from his attacker. David felt a ray of hope when he touched Bradley's body and felt warmth. He quickly took him out of the car and placed him on the concrete floor, trying to perform CPR, but tragically, he realized Bradley was also no longer alive. After that, David ran into the house to call 911 again and rushed to his grandfather's house looking for help. But in his heart, there was only panic. When investigators arrived at the scene, they found Kimberly lying on the garage floor with a head wound and her pants removed. Bradley's body was lying on the back seat of the car, while Jill's body was similarly injured. Police officers suspect that all 3 people were shot dead. During his testimony, David emphasized that Kimberly would never hurt herself or their children, which further increased suspicions about him. Another notable discovery was a sweater found next to Bradley's body, along with a fingerprint that appeared on the door of the Ford Bronco, but its origin could not be determined at the time. These findings only add to the complexity of the investigation. Police initially speculated that a robbery had occurred, but this theory was quickly abandoned when there were no signs of forced entry into the garage, nor was anything stolen from inside the house. Although David cooperated with the police, they could not completely trust his testimony. Investigators began to consider suspicions about David because the crime scene seemed surprisingly neat. Notably, there were no signs of any disturbance or protest taking place at the scene. A forensic analyst discovered bleach stains on David's floor, along with finding a barrel and a bucket inside the house, suggesting possible tampering with the scene. Despite suspicions, David was not officially considered a suspect at that time. Detectives collected evidence from the scene, including the shoe David was wearing, and sent it off for analysis. During this difficult period, both Kimberly and David's family stood by his side. Neither of them believed that David could be responsible for his family's tragic death. During an autopsy at the Kentucky Medical Examiner's office, the report confirmed that all 3 victims had been shot to death. The fact that the entire family was murdered in these circumstances left many unanswered questions and increased David's pain. The results from the autopsy revealed many heartbreaking secrets. Kimberly's cause of death was a single gunshot to the head, which highlights the brutality of the case. However, her body had many bruises, although there were no obvious signs of assault. Jill's cause of death was similar to her mother's, who was also shot in the head. Bradley was shot in the left shoulder, resulting in severed spinal cord and instant death. Another shocking secret was revealed on October 1, 2000, when memorial services for Kimberly, Bradley, and Jill took place. David Camm was summoned to the Indiana State Police Department for formal questioning. The irony of the situation makes him feel betrayed, as his closest friends and colleagues now suspect him. A feeling of anger and helplessness filled David's heart when faced with the people he once considered family. During the interrogation, David insisted that he had nothing to do with his family's death. He emphasized that the timing that people consider unusual may not be accurate, and asserted that he cannot be responsible for what happened. However, evidence collected by police, including sounds heard from his home around 9 p.m., led detectives to suspect that the crime took place shortly after he returned home. Detectives began focusing on blood stains on David's shirt. They analyzed the blood sample and found it could have been blood splattered at high speed, which often happens when a shot is fired from close range. This made David more suspicious, as evidence showed he may have shot someone from close range. David again denied all allegations, asserting that detectives had misunderstood the incident. Meanwhile, another disturbing piece of information was revealed from the autopsy report. Jill had suffered rape before her death. This makes detectives doubt David's responsibility in this incident. Although he firmly denied it, the evidence collected by the police led to David being charged with 3 counts of murder after the interrogation. Even though the odds were stacked against him, David still had a strong alibi from his fellow basketball players, including his uncle Sam Lockhart. They all confirmed that David was present in that match. While David sat awaiting trial, the prosecution actively built their case. They believed David murdered his family between 9:23 and 9:30 p.m., just before he called 911. However, this theory was soon corrected when David Camm's trial began on January 14, 2002 in Floyd County. The case attracted media and public attention, as many people in the small Indiana town felt shaken by the brutality of the crime. Defense attorney Michael McDaniel, understanding the importance of the trial, prepared to defend his client. Initially, the autopsy report indicated that the murder occurred between 7:30 and 8 p.m., which may have favored David. However, the prosecution argued that David snuck home, committed the murders, and then returned to the match without anyone noticing. They claim that David subtly manipulated the crime scene and that the entire plan was carried out just to avoid detection. Things gradually became more tense as the trial unfolded, with a large focus from the public and media on David. The evidence against him is mounting, putting David in more danger than ever. During the trial, the case became increasingly complicated with conflicting evidence and testimony. The prosecution has argued that David Camm may have created a fake alibi to mislead police. They pointed out that the distance between the church and David's residence, along with the distraction of other players during the basketball match, gave him the opportunity to commit the murders without anyone noticing. Another key point in the case is the phone call David made at 7:19 p.m., just minutes before Kimberly and the children returned home. This appears to contradict David's statement about not being at home during that period. However, defense attorney Michael McDaniel made a shocking argument, arguing that the phone company had difficulty recording accurate times. He said there was a 1-hour difference between the actual time and the time recorded in phone records due to time zone differences. A phone company employee testified that this problem resulted in incorrect time recording, and that David's call actually occurred at 6:19 p.m. before his family had arrived home. Although the situation seemed difficult for the prosecution, they still had one important piece of evidence: small drops of blood on David's t-shirt. They said that Kimberly's blood on his shirt was clear evidence that David was the culprit. However, a bloodstain expert hired by the defense argued that the drops of blood could have appeared when David bent down to remove his son's body from the sub. He also suggested that the stain could have been caused by David's shirt coming into contact with Jill's hair, but there was not enough concrete evidence to prove this. The prosecution also pointed out that the motive for the murder could be related to David's adultery. One of the witnesses, Kimberly's friend Marcy McLeod, witnessed the last conversation between the two, in which Kimberly suggested that history is repeating itself, hinting that David may have returned to his routine: adultery. Evidence of sexual abuse against Jill was also presented. Dr. Tracy Corey, who performed the medical examiner, believes the act occurred between 12 and 24 hours before Jill's death. If this behavior took place in the approximately 12 hours before her death, then David had no opportunity to reach Jill after 7 a.m. on the morning of her murder. However, if this behavior occurs within about 24 hours, it can change the case scenario. David steadfastly denied all allegations related to sexually abusing his daughter. Proving that he had abused Jill was a major challenge for the prosecution, and David was not charged with this crime. However, this issue remained a controversial topic throughout the trial. After 2 months of deliberations, on March 17, 2002, the jury returned its verdict. David Camm was found guilty, and the reaction from his family was strong. They felt the jury made a mistake and could not accept the verdict. In contrast, Kimberly's family, although initially not convinced that David was involved, changed their position during the trial. Kimberly's parents, Janice and Frank Wren, eventually believed that their son-in-law was actually the killer. Meanwhile, David's family, especially his siblings, continued to defend his innocence. David's legal battle continues as his new defense attorney, Catherine Lyle, resolves to appeal and request a new trial. On April 11, 2002, David was sentenced to 195 years in prison, but the truth behind the case still remains unclear. Charles Burnett, a person connected to David, appears in the story with controversial statements. In August 2004, the Indiana Court of Appeals overturned David's conviction, strongly criticizing the judge's decision to allow evidence related to the affair. New prosecutor Keith Henderson begins to review the case and is determined to determine the truth. During the investigation, key evidence related to a gray sweater found at the crime scene was long overlooked. The shirt contained blood and DNA from an unidentified man and woman, neither of whom matched David. Surprisingly, the man's DNA matched Charles Darnell, a recently released convicted criminal. Charles Darnell, nicknamed Backbone, has a criminal history involving violence against women and has been convicted of armed robbery and attempted kidnapping. Charles Darnell's involvement in the case sheds light on many things, especially the fact that one of Kimberly's shoes was found on top of the Bronco, while Charles has an obsessive history of stealing women's shoes. On February 17, 2005, police located Charles and brought him to the prosecutor's office for questioning. Charles admitted the gray sweater was his but claimed he donated it to a charity. However, after taking a polygraph test, it was discovered that he had lied. Charles's car was then tracked, and it was discovered that it was moving near where the victims were buried, raising further suspicions about his involvement. A fragment of a woman's DNA was also found on the sweater, matching a woman named Mala Singh Mattingly, who was Charles' girlfriend at the time of the crime. Finally, Charles' fingerprints also matched the fingerprints on the exterior of Kimberly Camm's car. When David was released and the murder charge against him was dropped, his family rejoiced at this relief after years of legal trouble. However, this joy was short-lived. Once again, David was arrested and announced that he would face new charges, making any hope of an end to the legal battle dim. This fight continues to confirm that the truth can sometimes be far from reality, and justice is not always easy to achieve. David Camm's legal battle has entered a complicated new phase as he was charged with an additional charge of conspiracy to commit murder, alleging that he and Charles Bonnet were accomplices in his family's murder. Not long after being freed, David was arrested again. Prosecutor Keith Henderson explained that they could not allow David to go free because of concerns that he might flee, especially as David had previously been sentenced to 195 years in prison. David Camm always steadfastly denied knowing Charles Bonnet, but things became more confusing when Charles changed his testimony after his arrest. Initially, Charles insisted that he had never met David. However, after being questioned, Charles began claiming that their first meeting had taken place in July 2000 during a basketball game at a local park. Charles also claimed that during one of these meetings, David asked him about how to purchase a clean and untraceable gun. According to Charles' testimony, he contacted an old friend, Gary Gherkin, to purchase a .380 caliber gun, which Charles sold to David on the afternoon of the murder. Charles further asserted that he followed David to his house and witnessed the incident occur. Charles testified that when Kimberly and the two children returned home, he heard gunshots. According to him, David came out of the garage after the incident and pointed the gun at Charles. Notably, during the investigation, Charles was arrested and charged in connection with the murder. Both David and Charles were charged with 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder on 9 March 2005. Charles's trial first took place in January 2006, where he repeated his testimony about the sale of guns to David and witnessing the murder. However, the jury had difficulty accepting that Charles was not an active participant in the crime. Finally, on January 26, 2006, Charles Bonnet was convicted of the murder of the Camm family and conspiracy to commit murder, and he received a sentence of 225 years in prison. For David, his trial began on January 17, 2006. During this trial, the prosecution's experts focused on analyzing the bloodstains and the charges related to the conduct. Sexual harassment against David's daughter, Jill Camm. Prosecution experts argued that both evidence directly implicated David, while defense attorneys tried to reason that he could not be responsible for those acts. David felt stressed and angry at the false accusations against him. He tried to assert his innocence, but on March 3, 2006, a jury found David guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, leaving his and his family's efforts and hopes crushed by the court strine. Even though he was convicted, David did not give up his fight for justice. He continued to maintain his innocence, claiming that Charles Bonnet had fabricated statements in an attempt to incriminate him. David's family, especially his parents, had to mortgage almost all of their assets to pursue justice for their son. They continuously supported David throughout his time in prison, and the constant search for justice became a mission for them. In June 2009, the Indiana Supreme Court overturned David's second conviction, marking a significant step forward in his legal battle. At this moment, David felt hopeful and surprised to learn that his sentence had been annulled. In July 2010, the Indiana Supreme Court appointed a special judge to oversee David's third trial, ensuring that the case would be reviewed fairly and thoroughly. David's defense team in the third trial included Stacey Ulana and Richard Kamen, who worked together to clarify the truth about the case and exonerate David. They focused on collecting evidence and documents to prove that David was not the person who committed this terrible crime. David Camm's legal battle is not over, and while the truth is still in the process of being discovered, the perseverance of David and his family has brought them back to the path of justice they have always pursued. With hope and determination, David Camm continues his fight to be exonerated, even though things still seem to have many challenges ahead. In February 2011, the defense made a substantive request to have prosecutor Keith Henderson removed from David Camm's case. The request was based on information that Henderson had signed a $4,000 contract to write a book about the Camm family murder case. This has raised concerns about bias in the proceedings and the possibility that Henderson could not ensure a fair trial for David. In February 2012, Stanley Levko was appointed special prosecutor for the trial of David Camm, forcing him to thoroughly dig into the details of the 13-year case. With a large number of documents and complex evidence, defense attorneys have made every effort to prepare for trial. On August 19, 2013, the third trial began in Lebanon, Indiana. One of the notable points of this trial was the appearance of Charles Bonnet, who testified. During this trial, much evidence from previous trials was introduced, including discussions of bloodstains and allegations of sexual harassment by Jill Camm, David's daughter. Although the prosecution attempted to argue that David's motive was related to the life insurance policy that David's wife, Kimberly, had purchased just months before her murder, the defense countered that Kimberly is not the only one with insurance. In fact, David also bought a life insurance policy for himself, which created doubts about the prosecution's allegations. In addition, there was the emergence of new evidence in the trial, with testimony from Mala, Bonnet's ex-girlfriend. Mala said she saw Bonnet leave the night of the murder, and Bonnet told her he was going to support a friend. This testimony led the prosecution to argue that the friend Bonnet was referring to was David Camm. Mala had also noticed Bonnet showing signs of excitement upon returning home, and she had discovered a scratch on his knee, which raised suspicions about Bonnet's involvement in the case. In addition to Mala's testimony, forensic experts discovered contact DNA matching Charles Bonnet on Kimberly and Jill's clothing. This discovery challenged Bonnet's claim that he never touched the victims and also placed Bonnet in a more active role in the crime. The prosecution presented an alternative theory that David assisted Bonnet in the murder but was not the shooter, but they were unable to provide concrete evidence to support this claim. At the trial, another interesting detail was revealed. The butcher shop where Bonnet often worked was also the shop owned by Kimberly's sister and brother-in-law. This is where Kimberly and her children often visit. Defense attorneys have argued that Bonnet could have followed Kimberly to the daycare and committed the crime to cover up his guilt. During the trial, Charles Bonnet was unable to provide accurate answers to many important questions, which raised doubts about the truthfulness of his testimony. After 8 weeks of arguments, experts and witnesses gave conflicting testimony, and the jury deliberated for 10 hours before reaching a verdict. Finally, on October 24, 2013, the jury found David Camm innocent. They saw that the truth had finally triumphed. David, in that moment, could not contain his emotions. He cried, bowed his head, thanked God, and thanked the jury. After 13 years of fighting in the legal system, David was finally free and exonerated, something his family had always craved. The emotion in that moment was indescribable, with the hope that finally all the pain and hurt that had passed would now be replaced by freedom and truth. David Camm's 13-year legal battle required not only courage from himself but also from those who supported him in his quest for justice. Even though the jury confirmed David's innocence, Kimberly's parents were still unsure about it, making feelings on both sides even more complicated. An interview with Charles Bonnet, who maintained his innocence, revealed the conflict that still existed in the minds of those involved. Bonnet, despite claiming his innocence, maintained that his time in prison led him to Christianity, something he found valuable. David has worked hard to rebuild his life since his acquittal. He moved to Indianapolis, where he worked as a case coordinator for a nonprofit that investigated cases where they believed people were wrongfully convicted. Despite his positive efforts to restore his new life, reconciliation with his ex-wife still cannot happen, because they still believe that David is guilty. In 2016, David reached a $450,000 settlement with Floyd County officials to resolve a civil lawsuit involving wrongful prosecution. This is considered an important step forward in seeking justice and compensation for his years of wrongful imprisonment. However, the question remains, can that amount of money compensate for the injuries he has endured? David realizes that there can be no compensation for the loss of freedom, reputation, and life he once had. Finally, David Camm regained his sense of freedom, and he could not contain his happiness when he stepped away from the constraints of the past. The feeling of freedom for him is a priceless thing that cannot be exchanged or replaced. Every smile, every moment he lives freely is a testament to human resilience and strength in overcoming difficulties. When this story ends, it leaves the reader with many thoughts about justice, truth, and the consequences that